afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second Enterprise Ireland Offshore Wind webinar. I hope everyone can hear me well. So the Enterprise Ireland cluster now numbers over 50 members, with an increasing number of cluster members having success in the offshore wind industry. While our nearest neighbour, the United Kingdom, is the leading global market for offshore wind, the sector is a global one. From Poland to the east coast of the US, from Germany to Taiwan, there are increasing numbers of countries looking to offshore wind to help facilitate the transition to a low carbon energy system and to meet carbon emissions reduction targets. This includes Ireland, and many of you may have seen the news yesterday that the Irish government has fast-tracked the development of 7 offshore wind farm projects as part of its goal of significantly increasing renewable energy generation over the next decade. The projects, which are being planned by 5 different firms, have been designated as relevant projects, which will ultimately allow them to apply under upcoming marine planning rules, which will be introduced by the Marine Planning and Development Management Bill 2020. This has provided some clarity regarding the development pathway for Irish offshore wind projects, which will be of interest to all cluster members listening in today. We will be covering the Irish market specifically in an upcoming webinar, so please do stay tuned for details on that one. Countries are, of course, at different stages of development, but it is fair to say that this is an industry and a form of renewable energy that is poised to go from strength to strength over the coming years and decades. To help us map out the global export opportunities, I'm very happy to say that we are joined today by Dr. Clarke and Sebastian Rae of the Renewables Consulting Group. RCG is an integrated market intelligence, management consulting and technical advisory firm focused solely on the renewable energy sector. RCG support mainstream and emerging technologies and serve the organisations leading the transition to a low carbon economy. Both Lee and Ray have a depth of knowledge regarding the offshore wind sector, and many thanks to them for joining us today. Not only will RCG provide an update on the global offshore wind market, they will also provide an update on the potential implications of COVID-19 on the sector. Timely consideration given the current situation we find ourselves in. In addition to today's presentation, RCG have also very kindly offered to make available to today's attendees the recently published Global Offshore Wind Annual Report. Produced by RCG's Market Intelligence team on an annual basis, the report provides an overview of the global offshore wind sector, an incredibly valuable tool for any supply chain company targeting the industry. Please note that the reports are being provided by RCG to webinar attendees free of charge, and as such, they should not be distributed outside of your own business. Before I hand over to Lee and Seb, please note that you can submit answers for our Q&A session at the end of the webinar via the questions bar in the control panel. I'll be tracking the questions throughout, and we'll put these questions to Lee and Seb after the presentation. For now, I'd like to hand over to Lee and Seb. The virtual floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Dara, and a good job you didn't hear my phone ringing just then, just in the nick of time. So look, first of all, thanks for everyone for joining this afternoon, and thank you Enterprise Ireland for hosting today's session. There's nothing more we like than talking about offshore wind. It's definitely a key part of our work at the Renewables Consulting Group. Just as by way of further introduction, I'm the Chief Operating Officer at RCG and a founder of the firm, but more importantly, I also take a very close interest in our market intelligence work and our strategy assignments for clients. And as Dara mentioned, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Seb Rae. Seb, maybe you'd just like to say a few words.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Hi, Seb Rae here. I'm based in RCG's London office. In a nutshell, I head up the market intelligence team at RCG. Been with the company for over 3 years now, and the annual report, which you'll be getting a copy of, and a lot of the information in this slide deck comes directly from my team.
Thanks, Seb. So today's agenda is as follows. We're going to kick off with an overview of the offshore wind market. We'll drill down into the regional and UK markets in a bit more detail. I will touch on the impact of the COVID-19 public health emergency. And then finally, Seb will conclude with some thoughts on the supply chain. And we'll try and leave plenty of time for Q&As at the end of the session. So we won't bore you with a long sales pitch, but I will just give you a little bit more background on RCG. We were founded in 2015, and right from the start, we had very much had an international dimension, setting up shop in London and New York simultaneously. As Dara mentioned, what makes us different is we specialize solely in large-scale renewables. Wind and solar, and especially offshore wind, are right at the core of what we do, but we also cover emerging technologies such as wave and tidal, energy storage, and interconnectors. We've currently got around 50 staff in 8 international offices, with London, New York, and Tokyo as our key hubs. Since we've started, we've been advising developers, suppliers, financial institutions, governments, and NGOs. Sorry about that. We are also technical advisors to the Crown Estate on its leasing process, and we advise the New York State on its offshore wind program. And we've just finished an assignment for Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry on offshore wind. So you can see that we're plugged into the international market. 2 of my colleagues even worked on the original Arklow project, one as project director for GE, so we bear the scars. That's enough about us, so on with the show. From this graphic taken from the Global Offshore Wind Annual Report, you can see that offshore wind is now truly a globally important technology. In recent years, the cost of offshore wind development has continued to decrease, further demonstrating its appeal as an alternative energy source. Global consumers, investors, and market players, they're all starting to recognise the increasing threats caused by climate change, and as a result, the near parity of energy costs between offshore wind and fossil fuel generation is leading markets can't be ignored any longer. As we all know, there's an unprecedented and a rapid transition underway in the energy system, and this is going to require trillions and trillions of dollars of investment. Grid transformation influences the priorities, whilst reliability and cost also remain top drivers. But we can see now that carbon and electrification are new imperatives. Before I go on, maybe Seb, you could just explain the ranking system that we use in our system.
Yes, thank you, Lee. The rankings for this chart represent 2019 only, and we're grounded on the level of activity within particular markets during 2019. We bring in a couple of metrics to try and attempt to understand which markets are moving, which ones are gathering momentum, and which ones are attractive for development. And those metrics include permitting and leasing processes and the volume of projects coming through both of those development stages. Also subsidy mechanisms in terms of the rate that is being offered, and the level of maturity and the level of rigor that exists in the subsidy regimes in various countries. Also targets, so government ambition to realise offshore wind capacity in particular, but also countries in general in terms of their ambition for increasing the amount of renewables in their mix. Also, we look at supply chain and research and development as well, in terms of development capability, domestic capability to supply components and services, and also whether governments are looking at funding programs to help increase the level of innovation in the sector. So those are the kind of the 5 main strands that move into these rankings. And in terms of countries that score highly in 2019, those will be typically markets where leasing, auction, offtake, and permitting processes are in place and well set and understood, therefore de-risking those markets for developers, but also in terms of momentum gathering, in terms of the amount of leasing and the amount of permitting that's taken place. And hence that's why countries like the United Kingdom, Taiwan, and the United States are at the top of the list. There was a level of activity across all of those metrics in 2019.
Thanks, Seb. The one further thing to add is that the floating offshore wind market continues to take shape and is beginning to offer a realistic energy source in some countries and in some circumstances. So we will touch on that through the presentation as well. One final point, the global health emergency due to COVID-19 has dented confidence and is causing some short-term delays, but we believe firmly that the long-term picture is positive. The boxes at the bottom of the screen there show the level of capacity that is currently operational, 20 gigawatts. The amount which is permitted and has a power purchase agreement or similar in place, so a route to market, and that's over 36 gigawatts now. And then a large amount, over 130 gigawatts that is currently in development. So drilling down into the global market, Europe still remains the largest market in total, but we can see that momentum is building globally. This isn't Europe going backwards, of course. This is all markets showing significant growth. Almost 3 gigawatts of capacity came into operation last year, and slightly more started construction. A huge volume of new lease area also entered the pipeline, and whilst it might take up to 10 years to complete the cycle from start to finish, some projects will of course drop out during that journey. It does sort of indicate the potential scale of the offshore wind market, and it's not only the scale of the market that's grown. The projects themselves continue to increase in size. We saw that in 2019. And we also saw the introduction of 11 and 12 megawatt turbines, enabling developers to go back to their projects and re-evaluate the size of the turbines they were using without encroaching on the limits of existing lease agreements. And in fact, just this week, Siemens Gamesa launched their new 14 megawatt turbine, which has got an incredible rotor diameter of 222 meters. It's absolutely enormous. These advances in technology aren't just limited to the established offshore wind markets, as we've seen plans for projects in the United States and in Brazil, for example, planning to use these new uprated turbines. As I mentioned, plans for floating offshore are beginning to take shape, and we've seen some early projects designed to power and offset offshore oil platforms. And we've also seen plans formulated for turbines designed to support hydrogen fuel generation. You can see from the charts on the right-hand side of key markets that the UK and Germany lead the established markets. But you can also see the ambition across a spread of countries, including South Korea, Japan, and Poland here, and also the very large others bar at the bottom, which covers a wide range of other countries. Moving on to our sort of view of the overall global forecast by region, you can see that demand for large-scale renewables is growing. The cost is becoming highly competitive now, and demand is building for clean and flexible energy sources. 2/3 of global investment in power capacity will come from renewables through to 2030. Individual markets and geographies all obviously carry unique opportunities and barriers in some instances, but the global growth trajectory for offshore wind is very strong, we believe. Developing markets build and developed markets repower. The United States and Europe are replacing retiring thermal power capacity and are preparing for unparalleled levels of electrification. And offshore wind can provide capacity at the scale demanded as older plant retires. But growth in renewables is truly global, and economies outside the traditional offshore wind markets are now also providing opportunity. Technology, demand, investors, and policy imperatives are resulting in increasing project size, and the cost reduction has now begun to level the field. across many markets. With floating offshore wind, it needs to maintain the momentum that started for large-scale development, and if that does happen, then costs could fall quickly, and that requires visibility of volume and industrialization. Moving on to offshore wind lease auctions that we see coming along. Seb.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. This map and graphic illustrates the level of activity expected over the coming years across the globe. So echoes what you've already seen on slide 3 from the development index, that offshore wind is certainly proving to be a very global industry, and expecting to increase its coverage more so. In terms of a couple of highlights from this chart, I think in Scotland and England, the leasing rounds currently are underway. In England, the invitation to tender process has been kicked off for round 4, which is a round of approaching 7 to 8.5 gigawatts of new leasing off the coast of England and Wales, and that's expected to be finalised by next year. There's also the ScotWind leasing process in Scotland, which is expected to start imminently, and I believe that's up to 10 gigawatts. These really do mark an important milestone for the United Kingdom, as they're the largest leasing rounds to take place for a decade. There are also across the globe some other key markets moving into new leasing and auction processes. Japan is still expecting to run an auction and leasing process for its first areas in 2020. Taiwan has already been through a process which concluded in 2018, and those projects are entering construction very soon, but they're looking at a third round of auctioning towards the end of this year and into next. Obviously, there may be some impacts in terms of the COVID-19 healthcare emergency, but we can touch on that later. And as you can see, other markets such as Denmark and Germany, France and Belgium, all expected to lease new areas of seabed over the coming years. In terms of the US, I think that's certainly the major concern, if you like, in terms of progress and momentum. There's been some issues with attempts to lease areas off California with the military, and also a lack of clarity in New York on leasing new areas off the United States East Coast. And I think those who know the European market well will know that delays in leasing can lead to drops off in demand for the supply of components further down the line, which is a struggle for supply chain. So I think the United States is the only kind of amber warning there, really. But as you can see, a lot of activity expected. Great, thank you.
So scaling down then to focus in a little bit more on the European markets. Perhaps Seb, I can hand over to you to pick up on this one.
Yes, thank you very much, Lee. In terms of Europe, with the graphic on the left, you can see that almost 20 gigawatts of offshore wind is operational, with a route to market secured of over 25 gigawatts. So almost expecting to almost double in terms of installed capacity by 2025. In terms of the key markets, a very similar graphic that you've already seen, but obviously looking at Europe just now, you can see that Ireland comes into the mix in this market. I think Poland and Ireland are very similar in terms of their state and their momentum at the moment. There's a lot of leasing or a lot of projects that have been put forward, and both governments attempting to bring the policy regimes into place to allow developments to take place over the next decade. So those are two markets very much to watch. And as we've already touched on, the United Kingdom and Germany lead the way in terms of the amount of capacity that has been built and is set to be built over the coming years.
So Europe is very much at the cradle of the offshore wind market. It's the home for the majority of the leading manufacturers, Siemens Gamesa and MHI Vestas Offshore Wind, both of which grew out of the marinisation of onshore wind turbines. And GE also has a substantial capability after acquiring French turbine manufacturers operating in the offshore market. And of course, many of the leading developers also are either European companies or have their offshore wind activities centered in Europe, and that's reflected in the table on the slide with Ørsted, Iberdrola, RWE, and Equinor firmly as global players on the list. Vattenfall and SSE are focused more on European markets at present. And then it's good to see some Irish names in the mix there as well, with potential there, particularly in the development phase at the moment. The map on the right-hand side shows the geographic distribution of projects at various stages of wind farm status here. The darker spots being the operational ones, and the lighter ones moving into more towards the development phase. And you can see that the southern North Sea, the German Bight, and the Baltic are key areas, but with significant opportunities elsewhere where there's good wind resource, a route to market, and some power demand and favourable water depths.
In terms of moving back to the forecast here, in terms of European markets, I just want to explain a bit of our methodology very briefly in terms of how we build this forecast. We have a database of projects, and we generate forward-looking views on all of those projects. So our forecast is built from the bottom up. So although we're aware of targets in various markets, we attempt to take ourselves away from that and look at how we believe a market might build up, and see how that then correlates with various targets. But you'll see on the left-hand side, if you're familiar with any of the targets in certain markets, that we do believe that some of those targets are achievable within the time frame up to 2030. So for example, the United Kingdom has a target of 40 gigawatts by 2030. We're currently expecting around 35 to be installed by 2030, given the current policy regime and the visibility that we have on future auction rounds. Germany is an interesting case. There has been a lot of lobbying to get their target up from 15 gigawatts, and that has recently been moved up to 20. But we still need to see some more clarity on how that may be achieved. Ireland, you can see there, we're slightly overshooting the current ambition of 3.5 gigawatts. There are a lot of projects ready to enter the system and be built by 2030. And as Lee has touched upon, projects can be built in a 10-year time horizon, if not even quicker. So that's what the market looks like from our side, with over 85 gigawatts expected to be installed by 2030.
So we just picked on a couple of the markets just to go into a little bit more detail. First of all, the United Kingdom. I think it's you've seen from the charts that the UK is currently the sort of leading country for offshore wind at the moment. The success of offshore wind in the UK is due to a broad political consensus that's emerged really over the last 2 decades. And this has been supported by relatively out of the money demonstration and small scale projects, and then scaling up through the various leasing rounds to support the industry to get into the highly competitive position it is now. The current government is still working on the offshore wind sector deal, which was published by the previous administration, which in itself shows the sort of level of consistency that we often don't see in UK administrations. And this targets 1/3 of British electricity from offshore wind by 2030. It reiterates a pledge of over £550 million, or over 600 million euros, by the government for further clean power auctions and the CFD rounds over the next 10 years. And that gives developers a clear pipeline of projects and really gives confidence to the market. And it sets out as well an ambition for the UK to be a leader in renewables, boosting exports to Europe, to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the United States, with a target of reaching around 3 billion euros per year by 2030. I mention this because only in that it shows the consistency of approach and a clear strategy how that can flow through to the supply chain. The government has also set up an offshore wind growth partnership to foster leadership in the next generation of innovations, and these include robotics and advanced manufacturing, new materials, support for floating wind, and research into larger turbines. I guess it's always difficult because the turbine manufacturers themselves are based in mainland Europe, and some of the steel fabrication is also carried out offshore. But I think the government is really pushing for some of the value-added aspects of the industry, in addition to the sort of heavy industrial part of the sector. So I think that's good learning for the Irish market as well here. Those high-skilled jobs and the support services jobs that the industry can bring. The government policy has also been complemented by new leasing rounds from the Crown Estate and the Crown Estate Scotland, as Seb mentioned. And round 4 in particular includes the Irish Sea with a large new area marked for leasing, which of course could be of great interest to the participants of this webinar. And there's also extensions planned for other existing projects around the UK, and also floating demonstration projects, including one located in the Bristol Channel.
In terms of the UK forecast, staying with the UK for a bit here, up to 2030, we've already discussed that we expect a target of 40 gigawatts to be within reach, but I think this chart is useful to show, especially as Lee's just been mentioning, in terms of the consistency of approach, in terms of how the market in the UK has developed. It's probably worth noting, given what I was saying about the US market earlier, in terms of 2015 and 16, in terms of the drop-off in installation, was certainly contributed to the fact that that leasing had been slowed, and that's kind of a byproduct of a drop-off in demand later on. But also the electricity market reform was underway in terms of moving to a new auctioning system, which wasn't in place until projects that started delivering to 2019, 20 and beyond. You can see the light blue is the route to market secured capacity. The UK expecting to certainly hit a rate of between 1.6 and 2 gigawatts per annum of capacity up to 2024, and then from 25 to 26 onwards. This is a bit uncertain at the moment, as there's some more consultation going on around the next round of the CFDs, but we'd expect that rate to increase in order to hit the targets for 2030. And the level of the grey projects coming through that are under development, that will be determined by the government's ambition and the capacity caps for the CFD moving forward. But I think a very good example of a market that has a consistent and clear approach, delivering those per annum deliverables in terms of megawatts.
So finally, in terms of the sort of dive into the geographic markets, the United States, we thought it'd be worth touching on that. We certainly find it a market that's good to operate in, with obviously with the common language helps, and a common approach to business. It's been a little stop-start, and it's fair to say that President Trump is not a fan of offshore wind, as I'm sure you are probably aware from his Aberdeen golf course experience. But nevertheless, the first offshore wind project in the United States was the Block Island project, the 30 megawatt Block Island project, which started production in 2016. And I'm proud to say that RCG assisted with the project management for the turbine installation of that project. So, it's a market that's close to our heart. And despite the president, the individual states have a very high degree of autonomy, and state procurement commitments continue to drive market interest. In just the last year, 5 states have increased their offshore wind targets. In total, 6.4 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity has been contracted to provide electricity in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in New York, Maryland, New York, Rhode Island, Virginia, and Maine. So a big spread and a big spread of capacities within each of those states. But Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, all well over a gigawatt of power capacity committed in each of those states. New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut all announced winners of their first offshore wind solicitations during the summer of 2019. New York awarded Equinor for its 816 megawatt Empire Wind project, and Sunrise Wind, which is a joint venture with Ørsted as a partner, for its 880 megawatt project. And then New Jersey awarded Ørsted another 1.1 gigawatts for the Ocean Wind project. And Connecticut awarded Vineyard Wind for the similar sized Park City project. So you can see, there's a lot of activity going on there in the US market. And states have continued to increase their procurement targets. New York has increased its target from 3.5 gigawatts to 9 gigawatts. And Massachusetts, despite having a Republican administration, and New Jersey, they've also followed suit, increasing their targets to 3.6 gigawatts and 7.5 gigawatts respectively. So these are big ambitions from the US market. We can see it moving forward, and it's not just at the state level, even at the federal level. The Department of Energy has established the Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, and that has begun to fund projects as well going forward. We thought, we can't really do a view of the offshore wind market without touching on the impact of the coronavirus emergency. And although renewables is a resilient asset class, it's not going to emerge completely unscathed from the crisis. The pandemic has already resulted in a large negative impact on economic activities. I'm sure we're all well aware as a result of the great lockdown. Economic recessions, of course, tend to result in lower power use, and we've seen that with oil demand dropping, travel reduces, consumption decreases, and with the pandemic, we see travel curtailed and manufacturing all but halted. And if you layer on top of this the prospect that both consumers and businesses will struggle to pay their power bills, you can see an unprecedented cash flow squeeze for utilities, which are one of the principal developers of offshore wind. So on the surface, things may seem gloomy, but across most areas of the renewable sector, we expect continued growth, although maybe at a more modest level compared with what we expected only a few months ago during the course of 2020 going into 2021. There are three main areas impacted, and I've shown these on the slide. And the first one is around investment and development. The impact on output and the public finances is going to be massive. The IMF estimates that around $7.8 trillion have already been earmarked for support through the various schemes around the world to help the economies. And if you put that in context, I think they estimate that 130 trillion is the required amount of investment for the complete energy transition. So you can see it's a significant proportion of the investment anticipated for the power sector. The broad economic slowdown, as I've mentioned, has had a direct impact on measures to control the pandemic. Renewable energy requires massive upfront investments, and that also requires a lot of confidence in the investors. And the high debt levels that this generates will weigh heavily on the capacity of the private sector to invest. We saw recently that Vattenfall pulled out of the Netherlands offshore wind auction. But it's not the same picture across the board, because at exactly the same time, Iberdrola has announced that it's going to double down and accelerate its investment in renewables. So a lot of this will be driven, no doubt, by the sentiment of the players in the market, as well as how robust their balance sheets are. And of course, what we don't really know is how governments will choose to stimulate their economies. We've seen the leasing authorities are mostly pressing on with their processes to get the next round of offshore wind underway, perhaps only with some minor delays to allow for the changed circumstances in the developers and processes taking a little bit longer. But we've only seen 1 or 2 month delays so far. And we also see calls to use the energy transition as a cornerstone for stimulus packages to help promote economic growth after the pandemic subsides. So things like the EU's Green Deal could be vitally important in that circumstance. In construction and manufacturing, for projects in construction, we've seen a scramble to adapt to new working requirements. We've seen intricate supply chains linking multiple countries being stalled, and it's caused lots of problems. Siemens Gamesa had to shut down production of turbines because they were struggling to get the components from China. Over the medium term, we expect continued shift towards supply chain diversification as a result. Is this the end of globalization? I think it's certainly going to look a little bit different after this period. There was already pressures at play due to localization, with governments providing subsidies for renewables. They wanted, quite rightly, to see the jobs come home. We've got nervousness, particularly from the OEMs, about trade wars with China, and that's also led to a sort of a rethinking, at least a diversification of supply chains. And now we can see that resilience is a key aspect, and so I think some level of repatriation of production will be a result, and at least maintaining a critical mass much closer to home, at least in the operational centres, if not in the home countries. And then on the operations side, the factory shutdowns, the travel restrictions, these have all impacted on the ability of firms to optimise their operation and maintenance. Whilst local teams have been, carrying on as exempt workers, and they continue to handle the routine maintenance, major component failures often require overseas specialists, and that's been a bit of a challenge. And this reliance on an international workforce has obviously been impacted by travel restrictions and quarantine measures. We've seen one OEM adopt extraordinary measures, including chartering its own planes to fly in engineers to service offshore wind farms. And obviously that's not sustainable in the long run, but in the short run it keeps things moving along. The operators have also adopted a rather conservative approach to operating their wind farms, shutting things down at an earlier point than they may have done in the past, and delaying maintenance work will ultimately reduce availability and create backlogs. And we think this could overall impact the availability of wind farms by as much as 10% in the short term. But on the plus side, as a sort of a silver lining, if you like, we have seen an acceleration of smarter ways of working. There's a greater use of automation, of predictive monitoring, and digital operations. And in fact, we've even carried out surveys of wind farms remotely using video technologies and interviewing staff rather than doing sort of face-to-face field visits that we might have done in the past. And no doubt some of this will carry on into the future. And what's the response of businesses as a result of this? Well, I guess there's four key responses that might be considered viable here. And one is obviously to take all the measures that are needed to protect staff, and then to protect the short-term viability of your business. And you know, we've all been doing that, whether we're a consultancy business or a supply chain business or a major developer. We've been doing what it takes to keep things going. Then secondly, there's a bunch of no regrets actions that businesses can take, and these are things that make sense under all scenarios. But I guess what we're seeing, perhaps some of these are being accelerated by the imperative of the pandemic. You know, after this all is over, I'm sure that webinars and video conferencing and other ways of remote working are going to become the norm rather than the strangeness that they seemed at the beginning of all this. Of course, firms will plan out moves for the future based on the outcome of certain scenarios, and you know, carefully monitor things and make their moves as they see things develop. But I think we also see that other firms, perhaps those with bigger balance sheets, will no doubt capitalize on the opportunity and you know, make some big bets, make some bold moves, and you know, maybe the offshore wind market is one such area. But you know, we have to be careful, because betting the farm can often go one of two ways. So on to, that's the COVID side of the thing. So just on to the supply chain. I'm going to hand over to Seb for the next few slides, just to pick up on the supply chain as we move towards the end of the session. Hello.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, just for the last couple of slides, we've got some information here on supply chain opportunities and some lessons learned from, as Lee touched on, some of the localization requirements or policies that have been implemented worldwide. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the market, this slide breaks down some of the very high level sectors of the supply chain and of a project's life cycle in terms of the services that are required at various different points. So that's anything from development services, helping with environmental planning and assessment of proposed sites, right at the early stage of a project, and then all the way through to operations and maintenance, providing remote monitoring, subsea services, diving, and cable repair, and then in between, getting involved in construction and the supply of components. I think it's important to understand who your customer is. That's obviously very important. We've discussed some of the key players earlier on in the presentation in terms of owners and developers who are developing projects, but developers vary in their strategies and how they go about contracting, and that can vary within markets as well as you know, within the same market, as well as, you know, varying across markets globally. So understanding that you're trying to provide your service or your componentry, whether that's going to a developer or whether it's to a turbine manufacturer or whether it's to an EPC contractor, is very important. In terms of getting access to these people, obviously, you know, events that are run like this and from other bodies helping kind of with business-to-business opportunities are great. But also developers have project websites and supplier directories, and where you can register your business in order to hopefully supply services to either a project or a portfolio of projects over time. Just moving on to the next slide. These are a couple of charts to show some of the trends within the industry, which I think are also very important to understand, depending on the services that you're providing. Or a slight rule of thumb, you know, as markets mature and projects develop, they tend to move into deeper waters and further from shore as the earlier projects, which are a bit close to shore and shallower waters, become operational. On the left-hand side, you can see there is a slight discrepancy in terms of the starting points for each market, but obviously in deeper water or further from shore, different services are required, and the technology that's chosen by projects varies. So if you're working on the operation and maintenance side, for example, operation and maintenance strategies will be very different for a project that is over 150 kilometers offshore than one that is, within 12 nautical miles of the coast. Also, in terms of, we've just highlighted here some cable trends over time. Again, kind of linked to projects moving further from shore. The technology of choice in terms of whether it's HVAC or HVDC technology can be important as well if you have a capability that is well suited to high voltage direct current systems. Then those are certainly becoming more prevalent in markets like the UK, where there are a suite of projects over 150 kilometers offshore, but also markets such as Germany have been developing this and implementing this technology for the last 10 years and will continue to do so. There's also some opportunities in the Netherlands. So without getting into the detail of all the technologies, I think it's important to understand some of these high-level trends when you're looking at the services that you might be able to offer into the offshore wind sector. And then moving on to a final slide on supply chain in terms of lessons learned. Lee discussed this earlier, and I think I touched upon this earlier as well. All the various different markets obviously would like to create jobs and kind of maintain level of investment locally. This is some examples of the UK market in terms of its ability to attract investment. The Greenport Hull facility that Siemens Gamesa invested in to do turbine pre-assembly and blades was a very large investment that came probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I think that was announced, which obviously brought jobs into the UK market. And Mitsubishi Vestas Offshore Wind also followed suit with a blade facility in the Isle of Wight. But these sorts of things come about in terms of government setting policy out. Supply chain plans are something that are around in the UK, which developers need to submit as part of their auction process in terms of how they're going to bring skills and innovation and jobs into markets. And we've seen this in other markets such as Taiwan. A lot of the early projects in Taiwan have localization requirements, but each market has a different way of going about that. So it's, again, understanding your customer, also understanding your market in terms of who you might be able to partner with and how you can leverage your location to get into these projects. But I think just in terms of a health warning on this, it's very difficult to implement some of these strategies from governments, and nothing will really overcome obviously the value, the cost that you can provide. But there's certainly opportunities to deliver components and services from a local base, and in particular in the operation and maintenance stage of projects.
Thanks, Seb. So just to conclude, offshore wind is now a globally important sector, and it's also a cost-effective energy technology. It continues to establish itself as such, and as a credible alternative to fossil fuel-based energy sources. Europe remains the single largest market, but momentum is building in Asia Pacific and in the Americas, and it's that is a good opportunity for those businesses that do have a global outlook in terms of their services. The European countries are incentivized to expand their renewable energy portfolios through the various legislations to meet climate change targets, and offshore wind is playing a key role in meeting these objectives. And the UK is the largest offshore wind market in Europe, and as we've shown, this is because there is a broad political consensus around offshore wind, and that has supported the pipeline of opportunities both in the past but also stretching out into the future over the next 10 years, and that gives the market a lot of confidence. COVID will have an impact on renewables. The level of that impact is highly uncertain, and it's a pretty resilient asset class in that we need electricity. It's a long-term game, and we certainly expect continued growth, but with some short-term slowing. And you know, at the end there we pose the question, what is the motivation for the local supply chain involvement? And you know, it always was employment and cost reduction, and you know, trying to boost export earnings. But going forward in the post-coronavirus world, we think there's also going to be a focus on countries and companies trying to become more resilient, to become more responsive, and also, you know, with an eye on being able to reconfigure their businesses if something else unexpected comes along the line. Okay, I think that's us on the presentation side of things. We'd be very happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Seb. That was an extremely comprehensive overview delivered in 45 minutes on the button, which is all the more impressive. I've personally been writing down some questions as we go, and to be frank, I think you've covered quite a lot of it in your comprehensive overview. Just to remind people that you can actually submit a question via the question tab in the taskbar on the side, and that will come through to us so we can respond to those. Maybe I might just start with one, if that's all right, to both to Lee and Seb. You talked about you know, post-COVID, perhaps renewable energy and offshore wind being a stimulus for economies. You mentioned the EU Green Deal, and I think we've seen that the European Commission has come out and explicitly stated that the EU Green Deal and post-COVID economic recovery should be linked together. I just was wondering, aside from government spending and government support, how important power purchase agreements will be for offshore wind in the coming decade, shall we say. We've probably seen in the UK there in the last few weeks, a lot of people probably would have seen Nestle UK and Ørsted signing a 15-year power purchase agreement. So I'm just wondering if this is a growing trend within the industry, and if so, what percentage of the market share is it likely to hold?
That's a great question, Dara, and it's you know, there's been a lot of experience actually from the United States with power purchase agreements, and I think that's kind of the sort of center of where the work on the corporate PPAs really came from in the past, and there's lots of different sort of structures available. It's been important, even in the last few rounds of offshore wind in the UK, sort of thinking about this. Most of the contracts for differences now have got a 15-year tenure, and that leaves wind farms thinking about their route to market for power for the final 10 or 15 years of the lifetime of the project. So in the utilities or the developers have already been sort of thinking about this, but as you say, we're now seeing some big players coming into the market to look at this way of supporting, and that's driven by some of these big corporate buyers, particularly the ones who are involved with initiatives such as the RE100, where they've committed to 100% green power for their operations, seeking a long-term structure which can give them green energy at an agreed price over a long period of time. And the likes of some of the IT firms like Facebook and Google and Amazon, who are running big server farms, those are sort of good clients for that type of activity. The issue is always on the PPAs is about the sort of security of the contract going forward, and so it needs a good guarantee of revenues through the PPA to make it viable. But companies with strong credit ratings such as Nestle and Amazon and likes of Facebook, they are suitable candidates for these sort of services.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question I had was around other competing forms of renewable energy. So in the last couple of months, we've seen here in the UK that the government is once again supporting onshore wind development after a near effective ban of 4 years. I'm just wondering, would you have a sense of how onshore wind, solar, etc., might affect or impact offshore wind generation targets out to 2030?
Seb, do you have a view on this at all, or?
Yeah, I mean, my immediate view on that would be that, you know, there's still very much a carve out, might be the wrong word, but the offshore wind policy, you know, is very separate and very clear in terms of the structure of the CFD. They're currently consulting on how best to set it up, but you know, onshore and offshore wind will not be in the same pot by the looks of things, and they won't be competing directly with each other. So, you know, I think the government certainly in the short term, you know, has indicated that they wish to, you know, kind of maintain the ambition for offshore wind and those kind of routes to market, certainly within the same policy setup, but on different trajectories would be my kind of immediate view on that.
I think I would just add that I don't think that the UK government is a particular fan of onshore wind. I think it's more of that they've agreed to allow some capacity through rather than a strong endorsement. And I think there has always been a view within the industry that, you know, in certain circumstances and locations, and I'm particularly thinking about, say, remote islands where there's a big opportunity if we can interconnect some of the Scottish islands to the mainland and use that to transport onshore wind from those locations, that should be acceptable, providing that, of course, the local people are supportive, and that seems to be the case in those circumstances. So I think it will be a slow build up on or a slow continuation of onshore wind rather than a major challenge to offshore wind.
Okay. Another thing we've obviously seen over the last couple of months, it's been from a historical perspective, there's been a lot of things happening in the last couple of months, but one of the major things from the energy sector has been a quite a large drop in both demand and in the cost of oil as well. So I know, looking at some public statements coming out from the likes of Bernard Looney at BP, you know, he seems quite adamant that this will, that COVID-19 will accelerate diversification plans, BP's diversification plans at least. Are you seeing the oil and gas as a sector that will enhance renewable offshore wind generation over the next 10 years? I know with the likes of Total now are coming into the sector as well. Are the diversification plans of oil and gas majors, is that going to have a large impact on the industry over the next 10 years?
Well, I certainly think it will over the 10-year period. You know, as you mentioned, there is, you know, tremendous pressure on the oil majors at the moment. We saw Brent crude dropping to below $20 a barrel for the first time in 18 years, and you know, other major oil benchmarks across the world have sort of tumbled at the same time, including some negative prices reported for delivered products in the United States when storage reached full capacity. And we've, you know, anyone who's got some investments in the shale oil sector in the States will be under huge financial stress under the current environment. And I think we've seen, you know, some of those smaller players like Enbridge really suffering as a result. And you know, the real big players, the Total, Shell, BP, Repsol, and state-backed players such as Equinor, they've all committed to reducing carbon emissions, but equally, in the short run, they rely on using profits from oil and gas to fund the energy transition, and they've all announced sort of major capital expenditure plan cuts across the board, and some of that has included renewables. I think Total announced capex cuts of more than $3 billion, or around 20% of its total capital program recently, and within those cuts, 300 million was within its were capital cuts within its renewables segment. So although it was not such a big proportion of the total, they were still having to pull back. But I guess we we anticipate that as the economy picks up, those pressures will start to diminish, and certainly I think governments will be very keen to press on with electrification, and that will put increasing pressure on those players to make the shift.
Great, thanks. I'm just have noticed that we just hit 3 o'clock, but I think for those who are still on the line, I think we'll continue for another 5 to 10 minutes just to run through the questions. So Stephanie, I hope that's all right with you both. So we have just another question on local supply chain targets across various markets. So obviously in the UK has an aspiration to hit 60% local supply chain. If we were to look towards France, for example, which maybe some people believe rightly or wrongly that it may be somewhat protectionist in its supply chain outlook. Are there considerations that our cluster should be aware of when looking at individual markets, particularly relating to explicit local supply chain targets?
Is that primarily in Europe? Sorry, Lee.
No, you go ahead, Seb. Sorry.
Just going to ask, is that primarily a Europe focus, or are you speaking?
Yeah, I think we can probably focus on Europe for this one. Just have knowing myself that it is quite a big thing here in the UK. I'm just wondering, and that aspiration is held up as a stated objective from the government. I'm wondering, are there other local supply chain considerations? Yeah, let's say here in Europe that we should be aware of.
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite a difficult topic to discuss, because I think EU rules don't really allow for countries to request local content and set percentages and levels, and certainly more familiar with the UK policy than any other, but that is obviously an attempt to influence developers' behaviour and make sure that the importance of supply chain local content is highlighted at an early stage, and the ScotWind leasing process in Scotland is attempting to take that further by introducing kind of supply chain plan kind of elements at an even earlier stage in terms of entering when you're entering the lease, so that there will be some element of discussing how you will be bringing local supply chain or attempting to bring local supply chain into your projects in Scotland and ScotWind, and that'll be right from the start. But again, a lot of this is still to be finalised, and whether governments actually have a mechanism to stick to that is up for debate. In terms of France, I'm not actually aware of any particular again levels of local content that is required, because I think that would breach EU regulations. But in terms of certainly bidding for projects for round 1 and round 2, the commitment of developers to build manufacturing facilities in France has obviously led to a huge chunk of that content coming from France, but also had a negative impact in terms of the cost of those projects coming forward, which was renegotiated recently. In terms of the Netherlands, I think they've been very open in terms of really just looking for price, and then more recently in terms of the zero subsidy auctions, certainly innovation have been a very important part of those, and likewise in Denmark, I'm not aware of any particular supply chain content rules and things. So perhaps the amount that it's discussed in the UK kind of skews the picture, because I think a lot of markets are very kind of neutral on this, but the regimes do differ across the board. I think in terms of the global picture, Taiwan was already mentioned. There were some stringent local requirements on a certain number of projects over there, and we haven't really seen the Japan legislation yet, but you know, I'd expect there potentially to be some level there, given some of the tie-ups that we've seen with EPC and installation contractors. So the likes of Van Ord partnering with local companies in Japan as part of a JV offer clearly indicates that they expect to have some sort of local presence.
Yeah, I think in those markets, I think local collaboration and partnerships are probably going to be key going forward. You did, I think Lee covered it already in the presentation, but maybe I just wanted to touch upon it again, and that is the impact that we've seen from COVID-19 on globalization and supply chain efficiency, I guess. I'm wondering, do you anticipate a focus on nearshoring to help limit supply chain disruptions moving forward in the industry? You know, does this present an opportunity for the supply chain in this part of the world?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it could go. I think it would certainly lead to a supply chain diversification. You know, a lot of not so much the you know, the major components perhaps, but when you look at you know, some of the sub components, they're coming from a truly global supply chain, and a lot of the smaller parts of the manufacturing chain come from China. Switches and small components that go into larger components are shipped across borders many times, and I think I certainly think that we'll see diversification, which I think could help countries such as India and Indonesia and Thailand in their industrialization, as you know, as alternatives to cost-effective alternatives to China for some of that componentry. But I think also we'll see manufacturers bringing a lot of it back, as I mentioned, not necessarily to their home countries, but probably much closer to you know, to the region in which the wind farms are being built and operated. So I think we'll see European manufacturers bringing more of the production back to Europe, though not necessarily back to their home their home countries. And I think that sort of makes sense. And I think you know, for suppliers as well, I think that's you know, an important consideration.
Sure. On another point, and again, I think it is something that you've already touched upon in your presentation, Lee, and that was trends towards automation and trends towards digital solutions, interventionist solutions. I think it's probably fair to say that this corresponds quite strongly with a key area of strength in the Earth supply chain. I think we have a pretty good national capability around IoT, around automation and digital solutions. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe expand upon that and talk to us a bit more about the importance of these.
I would.
More,
Sorry, I just missed the end, that last sentence there, Dara.
Yeah, it was just about how much more in demand you're anticipating those types of solutions to be in the industry.
Yeah, I can't give a sort of a firm view or a firm number really, but I have, you know, what we have seen is that you know, those companies with those OEMs and those wind farms that had already been using predictive monitoring and digital, a strong focus on the digital operations within their wind farms have been the ones that have been able to you know, assess exactly where maintenance is best required in this during the crisis, and you know, make better decisions about what equipment to shut down and fault warnings, rather than risk severe damage to the equipment. And I think that will accelerate as a result of this, because I think those learnings, you know, it will have come so much into focus that you know, if we want to operate this wind farm with a, you know, a severely curtailed workforce under future circumstances, or then even a more efficient way of operating the wind farm, then those items will become more important. And of course, they are ideal services to offer from a sort of a knowledge economy, such as Ireland or indeed the UK in the long run.
Absolutely, I agree. I am conscious that we have taken up, and you've been very generous with your time today. Perhaps if we finish, before we finish, I might just ask one final question, and it's around recommendations for the Irish supply chain, particularly going into emerging markets. So these are markets perhaps that are maybe 7th, 8th, 9th on your index or beyond. Would you have any key tips for supply chain companies? I'd imagine getting your hands on the RCG Offshore Wind Annual Report is probably #1 anyway in your book, but I'm just wondering if there's anything you'd like to share.
Well, I don't know if I would really want to give massive amounts of advice on this, but what I would say is that we are no different to a lot of the people on this webinar, and we've dipped our toe into all sorts of markets, and you can't really beat boots on the ground. And of course, that's a massive challenge in the current circumstances. We were used to getting out to Taiwan and Japan and really making an impact, and I guess to a certain extent we were lucky that we've managed to set up shop in a few of those places already, and sort of gain a bit of a local presence. But that's I think that's vitally important, and doing that in a controlled way once travel restrictions begin to ease off. I think it's particularly in the developing, some of the more far away markets, in the cultural imperative of having a local office and a local presence, despite all of this COVID thing, I think will still be important going forward. We're still trying to find our way through how to use, the best use of video conferencing and talking to clients. But we've had some very successful conversations with Japanese and Chinese firms over the last few weeks in our own consulting business. It's not perfect, but we're trying to sort of feel our way through and make the most of it. And we're finding that people are being pretty generous with their time as well. And maybe it's because they're not spending a lot of time on airplanes and flying around and such like, that you can kind of get through to people, and they are prepared to give you time if you've got something more than just a sales pitch to say. If you can help them solve their problems, then they can be pretty generous with their time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it'd be remiss of me also to mention that, or not to also mention that Enterprise Ireland, of course, we have 40 offices internationally as well, and we do have market advisors on the ground who are willing and able to help the Irish supply chain, whether it's with market research around offshore wind markets in these emerging markets, or information around locals, etc. So again, if there are specific questions around any of the emerging markets, indeed any of the established markets, don't hesitate to get in touch. I think probably myself or Liam Curran are probably your best first ports to call there, and we can redirect you as required. Leah and Seb, I'm conscious again of the time, and I think I would just like to take this opportunity on behalf of the Enterprise Ireland offshore wind clusters to thank you for a really comprehensive overview today. I think it was really informative and really timely, and helps us to build a much broader understanding of the global offshore wind market. I've no doubt that will be extremely valuable to a lot of our companies as they develop and refine their business strategies, their export business strategies in this space. So thank you very much for that. I'd just like to add as well that, as I mentioned at the start, that the Renewables Consulting Group have very kindly offered to make available to today's attendees their recently published Global Offshore Wind Annual Report. I will be following up with all of the attendees from today with details on how you can access that report. So please be aware that I will be following up on email over the next day. Lee, is there anything you'd like to say before, or Seb, before we wrap things up?
No, that's great. Thank you very much, and thank you, everyone for listening, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak to you today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and obviously, please drop in on our website as well for any further information you want on the Renewables Consulting Group. But no, thank you very much for letting us present to you today.